I laughed at myself in the earlier video, the number of times that I said industrial revolution, like countries that had the industrial revolution, and if your country had the industrial revolution. So I will try to not say that as many times this video because I was listening to myself. I was like, oh my gosh, Andy, they probably have heard you say that a million times. So just the first time when the industrial revolution set off the age of imperialism, the situation changed. And we saw first in Africa, and then we saw in the Middle East, and then we saw in India, and then we saw in China. The rest of the world was being colonized by these imperial powers, reaping the benefits of this. So the story continues again in South Asia. We'll see it. It's a different picture, but still the same countries establishing colonies in Southeast Asia. So what happened? The British, we saw in an earlier section, were in India. They would expand into Burma, present-day Myanmar. And by 1886, Britain had annexed Burma and added it onto its colony in India as well, too. And we see here we have three different imperialist powers converged near Singapore. The British, the French, and the Dutch will colonize most of Indonesia at this time. And I wanted to make a connection to Singapore still today sits at one of the most important geographical locations in our world. These three European powers all converged here. And at the time, still today, I like to draw boats. My students make fun of me. But in terms of like shipping materials, still even via trains, via planes or ships, if you want to move the most amount of materials of goods that are traded, it's still by ocean liners. And we have here today two major markets in China and India. These are the world's two most populous countries in the world. And when we're moving goods, ships move through the Straits of Malacca and will go again to different markets. So this is one of the most important geographical areas in the world to ensure that the world remains connected today in 2023. And we saw in 1900 it was still a really important and strategic destination. Christian missionaries in present-day Vietnam used the execution of different priests as a casus belli to annex much of the region. This was the French. There was the spread of Christianity in that area, and several Christian missionaries were executed. The French used that as a casus belli, or an act or situation provoking or justifying war. And there was fierce resistance in Indochina, but eventually the French will take control of that area, the areas of Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. The Kingdom of Siam actually remained mostly independent from the British or the French. Under the rule of its king, Mongkut, at the time, he recognized the power of the imperial states. And while there were several treaties which subjected the Kingdom of Siam to British and French rule, it largely remained independent for a couple of reasons. Also, too, did also exist as a buffer state between the British and the French. So the buffer state is this idea of these French interests and British interests don't collide in one particular area, so they have a buffer state remain independent in between the two. What was it like, all of these colonies? The textbook says it pretty well. There's modern technology, which is again being introduced. There's the mining of materials like tin and the harvesting of rubber. But the last sentence says it well. These changes benefited the European colonizers far more than they did the Southeast Asians. This is, again, the world being forced together is what I call this particular area, just kind of the big idea. The United States will become involved as an imperial power as well, too. By the 1500s, Spain had actually conquered the Philippines and imposed its will on the country. The United States is eventually going to annex the Philippines in this chapter. But many people say that the Catholic Church there abused its power, leading to growing resentment among the Philippine populations. Jose Rizal urged nonviolent protests against the Spanish, but he was eventually captured and assassinated. So the population of the Philippines is trying to oust the Spaniards. And the United States almost accidentally becomes involved in the Philippines after it declares war on Spain over its involvement with Cuba. Cuba, the island nation just off the coast of Florida in the United States, was a Spanish colony. There was a movement there to become an independent country, but the United States saw that it could oust the Spanish from Cuba and take it over as a colony, which they did. And they also did it in the Philippines as well. The United States later crushed the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay, the Battle of Manila. Um, the actual, if I backtrack 1 second, the also the casus belli for the Spanish-American War was an explosion of the USS Maine, a ship. The explosion, I believe, still is slightly controversial. We don't exactly know how it happened. Some people say it was a mine or a torpedo. Some people say there may have been a plot to have the ship explode so that the United States could use that as a reason to go to war with Spain. Either way, the ship becomes this rallying cry. U.S. soldiers would shout, "Remember the Maine," and it eventually annexed the Philippines. Afterwards, Philippine nationalists led by Emilio Aguinaldo will battle the American forces. Hundreds of thousands of Filipino soldiers would die. Thousands of Americans would die in a contested dispute over the country. The Philippines would eventually acquire its independence, but it did have a mark of American imperialism on that country as well. American sugar growers, would at this time also be pressed for more power in the Hawaiian Islands. The Hawaiian Islands sit kind of in the middle of the Pacific, and we see that the British are expanding their reach in the Pacific. We see the Japanese are doing it. So American sugar growers pressed for more power in the Hawaiian Islands and urged to annex those islands. Queen Laliuokalani, however, tried to reduce foreign influence, but she was later removed at the request of the U.S. Based growers in that area, and the 8 Hawaiian Islands would be annexed and given to the United States in 1898, the same year that the Spanish-American War began. So the United States is expanding as an imperial power and joining those European countries. Europeans in Australia. Australia and New Zealand, this is the last chapter. Again, these are the 2 farthest areas of the world away from at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. So it makes sense that they were some of the last parts of the world to come into contact. The first settlers in Australia arrived around 40,000 years ago, and these indigenous people were known as Aborigines in Australia. Isolated from most of the world, the Aborigines, like even at the time of 1600, 1700, they lived in small hunting and food gathering bands, and their way of life was not really unlike that of the Stone Age people. There was over 250 different languages that were spoken. So this, again, we go back to a danger of a single story. We shouldn't forget about all of this history. Our textbook states that in 1770, Captain James Cook of the British came and he claimed Australia, the world's largest island, for Great Britain. But don't let the story just start there when we've got 40,000 years of Aborigines living in Australia. And it's true, we don't have access to much of their histories, but let's not forget it. And let's not forget that those small food hunting and food gathering bands lived, and there was families, and there was stories, and there was sorrow, and there was triumph. There was everything. I mean, like, there was laughter. There was so much, and we can't just have it start here. It's not as easy to think about these 40,000 years again because we don't have access to it, but that's not to say it still didn't happen. The indigenous people suffered disasters not unlike that of Native Americans after the arrival of Columbus in 1492, when British and later European countries came to Australia. They brought with them diseases that really decimated communities in and around Australia, and many of the Native American groups, the Aborigines, were wiped out in Australia. Australia eventually became a penal colony where convicts were sent as well too. But migration was eventually encouraged from Great Britain to Australia beginning around the year 1800. And Australia as a commonwealth was created in 1901. It remained close to Britain politically. And actually in 1856, women earned the right to vote. And Australia Day is celebrated, I forget what day, but here's fireworks over Perth on Australia Day when it became independent. But the textbook poses questions, what does Independence Day to mean to somebody who has Aborigines ancestry in Australia? It's something to contemplate, just the way that Native American groups would in the United States on the 4th of July. Europe and New Zealand. I start off with this awesome picture of a native Maori tattooing. Here, I confess, there are so many more stories to learn about this. This is an ancient custom. And from my understanding, the tattooing can symbolize someone's station in life and information based on their family. And it's intricate and it's elaborate. It's not something I understand, but it's something that is really, really cool. In 1840, Britain did annex New Zealand as kind of one of the last places in the world to be colonized. In Australia, the Aborigines were spread across the continent, but in New Zealand, there was about 100,000 Maori people who lived in New Zealand before the arrival of the Europeans. By 1872, that was less than 45,000. So there was resistance, but to go back to the Industrial Revolution, it was a story of the haves and the have-nots, and at this time, New Zealand will become a British colony. The country eventually achieved self-rule, though, too. And again, in 1893, women earned the right to vote. This is like almost 30 years before the United States. By 1907, it had achieved its independence, though it remained closely linked to Great Britain. This section kind of concludes the areas in the world that were, again, colonized by imperial powers. We can, again, see, if I read it down one more time, it's the world being forced together. And I think it's important to think about how the impacts of the age of imperialism might still be impacting us today. That's a C. I'm not really great with this pen.